Ladies and gentlemen, come one, come all, welcome to the 2022 Electromagnetic Universe World Expo! This next presentation is a two-parter put on by Shifu Ramon. Shifu Ramon is a father, multiple business owner, martial artist instructor, and healer in traditional Chinese medicine. He has a background in electrical engineering from the University of Kentucky. He is from Kentucky, where he works on the Hidden Kentucky Project in tandem with the Ancient Kentucky Historical Association. He is the author of over 80 alt-stream papers in extended plasma electromagnetic cosmology and pioneer of open source cosmology. He is the host of the Electric Pulse on Rumble. You can find his shows on the Leap Project
Step Potential,
Wednesdays at 8 p.m.
Plasmaglyphics and Myth solves our riddle. So when we look at this story, what does it mean that he seizes lightning and fried all of the animals? What one by one? How does that work? We do see, even in the Disney Fantasia, there is a scene where Zeus individually attacks the different mythological creatures, ruining their party. But that isn't necessarily what has to happen. In fact, step potential is something that people just readily don't understand. There was a story when I was doing my research out of Africa where a whole soccer team, there was a lightning bolt, but I guess one team was wearing light shoes and the other, or sandals, and the other team wasn't. And they all fell over and many of them died, and there was accusations of black magic. But so step potential it spreads throughout the ground. This is why we don't approach down power lines. Even if the power line is off, it could have discharged into the ground, and that ground could be storing the charge in a capacitive way. So if you go to the parts 3 and 4 of the Plasmaglyph Megafauna extinction paper, you can, of course, visit how I did my calculations. I call it napkin math, even though it's not napkin math technically, but it's using Maxwell. You know, these plasma shells and different atmospheric shells of the Earth, you don't have a linear like bolt. But even then, I still got within one order of magnitude of Pratt's work before I had even been able to review his papers themselves. And these were able to extend out thousands of kilometers. They might be a better, there might be a larger set potential if you use cylindrical coordinates instead of spherical coordinates. Which I use Uman's work because Uman's work is all about lightning physics. He's a top mind in lightning physics. But the bottom line is, the wider your footprint, the more deadly, because the same resistance is in the body, and more or less it's still about 30 to 50 milliamps that kills you. So the wider you have, the wider the potential, the more current you need to draw through to complete that circuit. So what I did was I ended up using the Colombian mammoth to calculate my, biggest footprint possible, and I had to average it out. But it does help explain for us why there's selective death. Why is it that the short-faced bear didn't make it, but the other bears did? You see, young grizzlies do climb trees, and black and brown bears do climb trees routinely. Dire wolves are pretty big, and they lived out in the plains. Whereas other kinds of wolves frequently live in dens, etc. You can apply this logic all throughout the megafauna. And in a lot of cases, whoever survived may have just been too far away to find anybody to breed with. I heard that that was even a theory among the standard theorists, because natives weren't known to hunt the giant ground sloths. So why were these giant ground sloths unable to make it? I contend that the ones that were out in the open didn't make it. The ones that were in caves were lucky, but then they may have just been too far away from other giant ground sloths. Whereas you had an explosion, and this is a well-known problem in the biological community. There's an explosion after the younger dress of bison, and no way to account for why there's a huge explosion. Well, it's because there's nothing to compete with them now. So kinetic explosions, bolide impacts, will not work, because the chances of you having a single one that is able to wipe out an entire northern hemisphere and not destroy everything and make a giant cataclysm in one spot is very problematic. It's just not going to happen that way. And on top of that, when you go up in power level, you run the risk of actually wiping out the entire planet. And you can't get selective with your species. And if it's too small, then you don't have enough to have extinctions anywhere, because if they would just come back. If you had a very small explosion, a series of small explosions all throughout the northern hemisphere, yeah, those areas would be wiped out of that animal, but they would all come back. And they're not being hunted to death. That's not going to happen, because you have tribes of people, dozens to maybe 100 at most, of which only 20% are going to be warriors. They cannot afford to go on a hunting expedition in which, in one instance, someone who took dozens of years to raise into maturity might be injured or killed. And if you throw an atlatl at a mammoth, it's not going to kill the mammoth, and it's certainly going to chase you down. And it can run. They can run. Elephants can run faster than humans. It's going to pick them up and smash their heads and bodies against the ground. They're not hunting these guys. Okay, they're lucky if they find them. That's for sure. Probably they did come across them, and in their need to survive, they probably did cut on them, but they weren't hunting them in that manner. That's complete nonsense. They were blown away. Randall Carlson has papers where the mammoths were blown right off their own feet, so their feet were still and they were flying. And this is a property of electricity. So this is a property of both the arc blast and the step potential combining together. I predicted in this paper that there was no impactor in Michigan, and about a year and a half after, they found the Greenland craters. I also showed that the Carolina bays were not from ice impactors based on the vectors, the ages, and the angles. The work for debunking Zamora's at all their entire camp is forthcoming, but it's just not one that I've worked on right now. It is something I promised for a while, so I need to get it done. Right, so plasmaglyphics and myth, earthworks, etc., tell us a truth. When we look into history, the easiest solution to all of these things, including the Egyptian, is that we had a different star. And in the star, it was said to rise in the west and set in the east, and it shone brightest at night, and it was green, etc. It probably died due to our current sun's electric field surrounding it and starving it of its own electrons. Saturn itself, so after they split and they become the owl motif, Saturn itself is then castrated and becomes so-called female. And then we see Heracles. So Heracles is probably Mars. They have a similar tilt angle. Enki is also known as the Lord of Diadems, and Venus was a comet. So it appears that even the heart of Quetzalcoatl was ripped out, not just that he went to the beach and ejected his heart out and it became the morning star in the Nahuatl, but that it was actually pulled out by the power of the sun, because the sun is much, much bigger than the star we're talking about. The star we're talking about is only 3 or 4 times the mass of an average between Neptune and Saturn, which is still large. It is not as large as most stars. In fact, it's on the order of star. That would be a smaller star than average, which means that maybe it was already destined to kind of pass away. Not exactly clear. It apparently made the world very sad, though. The Great Serpent Mound itself becomes a perfect reflection of comets, and we see in Comet Ison the jet and bow shock in it, and we see the same features at the Great Serpent Mound. So all of the mainstream explanations start to fall apart when you just consider lab science, empirical evidence. On the right, we see Peratt's work. We see the crown thunderbolt coming down. We see the Great Squatterman synchrotron formation, and that just happens to be a supernova on the right. He's just showing filaments. And up there we see Mazda or Zervan striking at the mythical creatures and them dying. Again, megafauna. Here are those Carolina bays. This is me doing the analysis of how you can see that they come at different angles, which if you extend out hundreds of miles are going to be states as far apart as Wyoming and Michigan. So that's not going to work. And also you can see that they are at different ages. Sometimes they go at different degrees, but you can see very, very clearly that a lot of them are within one another. And also when they overlap like that, you wouldn't have that. It has to either be a stamp from the top or a bubble from the bottom, but you wouldn't have them overlap without the edge of the newer one collapsing into the core of the older one. And then we also obviously see that there are these kind of interesting lips. So we have to figure out what that is. Not the point of this talk, unfortunately, but it is proof that we do not see kinetic activity. We see electrical activity. These are both from Kentucky. This is on the left there, the famous Middlesboro crater. And that arrow is going out of the Cumberland Gap. And we could see which way the bolide came in and where it struck. Funny thing, though, is there is some very strong evidence that this entire area was once electrically formed, which would bring to the idea possibly that the bolide itself was magnetized and magnetically attracted to this chain. Not really sure. On the right, there's Jephthah Knob, the highest point in the bluegrass region of the state. And again, we see a very clear bow shock and outventing. So those are definitely bolide strikes. Whereas here we have our Palladian thunderbolt. This was the topic of my Addendum 1 paper. 56 craters, which is what he predicted. And so I counted them, and he doesn't know anything about this work. As far as I know, Dr. Pratt is not clear that I've discovered a smoking gun Palladian thunderbolt for him. It is in an octagon shape. If you turn your head a little to the left and then you look at it, you'll see the octagon a lot more clearly. At first, you think that it is it's circular, but if you just turn your head a little left, boom, octagon. We see no bow shock, and all the fracturing is perfectly circular, as if the land was suddenly struck, boom. And so I contend this is a single pulse. There are one or two of these little craters. And when I say little, I mean these are 80 to 200 feet wide craters, but one or two of them have also a crater rim discharge where there's an extra bit of electricity that finally discharges. You have to go and see electric discharge machining to know what I'm talking about. So no bow shock. And one of the craters perfectly houses, it's one that has a crater rim discharge, perfectly houses the sea hinge mound at Mount Horeb in Fayette County. So this is between Fayette and what's it's between Lexington and Versailles. And the Mount Horeb at the northern Fayette County, the sea hinge mouth actually faces towards this thunderbolt, and the crater size fits directly in it. We have a whole video of me taking the Photoshop without scaling, just rotating it and putting it in place, and you can see when you look at the LiDAR that there's a rim and it perfectly houses the circle. It's unbelievable. The combination of the two is statistically, I would say, impossible. And besides that, we did measurements of the sea hinge mound, and it was electromagnetically, both electrical and magnetically active at the hinge mouth. These are the knobs of Kentucky, where we see giant Lichtenbergs, and you can see the flat spot where the arc connection was. And these types of electrical Lichtenbergs have been found on people with lightning strikes. It's found on burned wood. There's all sorts of things. There's no doubt about that. This electrical is completely different than the fluvial that we see up in the north of Gravel Switch there, or anywhere else in the state. And it's in the Knobs regions. And the entire Knobs regions wraps around the so-called giant dome, geodesic dome that is the bluegrass. And like I say, they are basically 900 foot. Funny thing, the AKHA, we went out to the Knobs region in Culverton, and we produced a paper, and the video is linked in the paper. We hired a drone operator, and the drone operator was flying at so many feet. And when he got up to that level, I think it was 400 feet elevation, the drone was electromagnetically pulsed, and he barely got the drone back. And so the video actually captures the moment where the footage stops. This was the secret Sprat site. We see, again, more motifs, the same fork serpent motif that was throughout the country. There's a not very well-known site. It's very secret. I have been to this site, and it is fantastic. And the squatter motif, there's all these stone mounds. Maybe there's Colburn, maybe there's Chinese. It's really not clear. It's all in one of my papers. And so we see that the King Arthur tradition definitely carries some strong weight in Kentucky. Again, I mentioned the Venus motif. They talk about the calendars. That's fine, but there are no giant egg-eating serpents in North America. We also see that there is the jet in front, and if you compare that with the Comet Ison imagery, you will see that triangular formation. Funny thing, this mound sits atop a crypto explosive event. We're not sure. They, of course, want to claim that it's a bolide event. It could be a thunderbolt. Somehow, there you get a very strong feeling when you're up there, no matter what. Here again, comparing on the right is Yucatan. You can see the bow shock. You can see the angle in which the asteroid came in, and you can see the outgassing of power. But when you look in the upper left there at the Hudson Bay, you don't see that. And on top of that, you see a central raised mound, which is an anode mound lifted up higher in elevation than the outer bit of the crater. And this is supposedly after it already went through all the layers of ice and water. And on the left there, the Behringer crater, again, turn your head a little to the left, boom, there's an octagon. And we see scalloping and other forms of electrical, and there are no bow shocks, and there are no shatter cones more than 100 feet or so below the surface. And they never found a real meteorite there. They do find probably transmutation. And that's another site I just visited. It's pretty spectacular as well. So these are, looking at the power. I don't want to overwhelm anyone with the calculations, but we're talking, at a full distance from the Earth to the Moon, these arcs would have been, 4 times 10 to the 16 worth of thunderbolts. If the Moon or any other object got even half the distance, and you get more, you get fewer need of thunderbolts, but you're going to get a greater chance of arc. So the number of these that it would take to boil Antarctica, we're talking 1.3 times 10 to the 5, roughly. And you can go ahead and adjust everything down by, an order of 10 to the 3, calculating the kill. It's all huge. This is the bottom line. It's all huge. You can get down, though, to you needing only potentially 2 of these Vajra to boil Antarctica, depending on, the distance that you use. Again, that's assuming that the breakdown voltage of the permeability of the space is 20 megavolts per meter. That may be different, actually. And since this paper came out, I do think that they may have revised that number, but don't quote me on that. We're looking here at the distance. You see Uman's work up in the upper right. You can see my graph down in the lower right, and you can see the yellow line corresponding to the current drops off. Again, there's this exponential. And, when you get out close to 1,000 meters there, it's starting to get pretty low. But even when we look at a limited Vajra, you're seeing, thousands of volts and 30-something milliamps. And you're hundreds to thousands of meters away. And again, I'm using a Columbian mammoth, and I don't trust this work at all. I have an entire page devoted to the destruction and criticism of the model that I used. But without supercomputers or access to the materials that Peratt had, very difficult to calculate how these thunderbolts would have actually behaved in the Earth, spreading out. I don't think that he spent any time on the set potential stuff. His work was in the 80s, and this work by Uman, I think, was done in the 90s. So not really sure Peratt would have had a good model to use anyhow. Right, so I hope that people come to the live presentation. Why does all this matter? It's your history. It's human psychology. It's what's formed our politics and economics and things like religion and culture. It shows up in our movies these days. There's a lot of movies with the gods in them. We're obsessed with the weapons of the gods, the destructions. It's not behind us. There you can get into, issues of Mars, Venus, men and women. You can get into sports. It goes all over the place. It's for sure true that our history is far more interesting and unique than advertised. Might have to do with our future through the Spacers movement and in general MIMS, the philosophy of futurization, that came out of the cosmology, and whether or not we are actually able to harness free energy and move about space. And if you come to my live presentation in Detroit there on the 14th, you'll learn about how we know our planet flipped over. And the key to that is actually found here in the Ohio River Valley. So very proud proud of my work, but I'm also proud of the people from this region. And I will be showing how we know that they had trigonometry and direct line of sight.